And the first speaker is Erika Jackson. There's Erika. She's a professor of history at Colorado Mesa University in Colorado, where she teaches courses in women's and gender history, history of sexuality, immigration, race and ethnicity, and other courses focused on modern U.S. history. She has written the book Scandinavians in Chicago, The Origins of White Privilege in Modern America, exploring Nordic whiteness and the Scandinavian ethnicity in Chicago in the late 19th and early 20th century. And a number of other articles as well. And she has been a Niels William Olson Fellow here at the Swenson Center. We have a fellowship to bring in visiting scholars. And Erika, I forget when it was.
2009.
2009, and now you're back.
Yes.
We're so happy. And the topic of your talk is Vikings and Dumb Blondes, the construction of an American discourse on Nordic and Scandinavian whiteness. Please, Erika.
Thank you. Situated here. Okay. I'm just setting a little timer for myself here. Okay. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all day. I won't keep track of the time. Okay. So thank you so much for that introduction. And let me. Oh boy. There we go. Okay. Figure it out now. So yes, I am always really interested as an author and a researcher in learning about the origins of other authors' projects. And I always see that there's some sort of kernel of a personal reason why researchers take on the topics that they take on. If you're going to devote 10 years of your life to something, it better be a topic that you're really interested in. And so this work began as my dissertation for my PhD, and it was revised and reconceived from its original version, and so altogether this was 10 years of work. So I began researching this topic in 2008, and my work has taken me to several different archives, including the Swenson Center, where I was awarded the Olson Research Fellowship in 2009. I also went to the Swedish-American archives of Greater Chicago at North Park University, the Newberry Library, the Chicago Public Library, and the Kenilworth Historical Society. I also had the privilege of going on an exchange to the Svenska Immigrant Institutet in Växjö, Sweden, and also Pacific Lutheran University when I first started working as a professor at Colorado Mesa University. And so this project began as part of my own personal interest in my family's heritage. So my mom, who is with us today from Michigan, so her family is of Swedish origin, and so her maiden name is Swenson. My mother's great-grandparents were immigrants from Sweden, Sven and Ellen Swenson, Americanized to Swanson, and they settled in Morley, Michigan. This was a very small farming community in Western Michigan. And regardless of the amount of time since immigration and the process of Americanization, my mother's family retained many symbolic Swedish traditions. Even with my generation, my cousins and I were exposed to the traditions of home. And so this was a very important component of my upbringing, but I also always sort of felt like an outsider, not because my family ever made me feel this way, but because I'm adopted. And so I've always had sort of this like quest for identity anyway. So recently, like within the last 5 years or so, my mom came across some papers that were given to them upon my adoption, and it turned out I'm Norwegian, so I know, it's the secret I'm sharing with you today. This got me to thinking about cultural and ethnic and racial stereotypes that Americans have and had about Scandinavians, where these attitudes originated from, and why they have such a long legacy in shaping viewpoints to this day. And there's my book, by the way. I have flyers out on the table out there, just shameless self-promotion. Okay, so Scandinavians in Chicago explores ideological gendered concepts of Nordic whiteness and Scandinavian ethnicity employed by native-born Americans. And this book advances a comprehensive understanding of the Scandinavian American experience by examining the process by which Nordics became the embodiment of what it meant to be white in America. The late 19th and early 20th century marked an important period in the fracturing of whiteness by anthropologists, sociologists, and pseudoscientists as a means of denoting cultural and physical difference between the white races in America. And I'll discuss this a bit more on the next slide. I have a racial hierarchy to show you. So the racial hierarchy constructed by these writers created distinct, immovable categories of race, though differences in interpretation and terminology led to confusion and messiness, especially in the press and within American culture. Americans and European ethnics understood these racial categories in completely different ways based on what bestowed their group with the greatest structural privilege, especially when addressing the apex of this hierarchy, which was the so-called Nordic race. American historians and newspaper editors, other writers repeated and expanded upon the language of Nordicism. The common response of most immigrant newspapers was to defend their race within the press. In contrast, foreign language newspapers and Scandinavian historians would mirror ideal racial and ethnic perceptions of Nordics created by the mainstream American press. So here's this racial hierarchy that I have up here, and I like to explain to my students when I show them this that my work actually complicates this racial hierarchy because many of the, quote-unquote race scientists of this era actually would have put the Nordics right up at the top rather than in the old immigrant category. We also see, but not Irish. So right above that line of whiteness. And so rather than constructing an authentic persona of the common Nordic immigrant, Scandinavians chose to play upon the observations of the American media as a means of benefiting their cause. By better understanding the process by which Scandinavians became a privileged immigrant group in Chicago, we can further address the problems encompassed in contemporary viewpoints toward immigration, race, and ethnicity, and how white privilege underlines such issues. Americans employed terms like hardworking, virile, trustworthy as exhibitive, feminized and masculinized ethnic traits. And historical considerations of Nordic whiteness cannot be fully understood apart from the social construction of gender as part of the larger process of defining race and ethnicity. Sorry, my timer went away all of a sudden. So as a post-structuralist, my work offers a closer analysis of the rhetoric Nordics use to self-identify and provides a greater understanding of social awareness of both hegemony as well as autonomy. So going in order, I want to begin by talking about the masculine Vikings. In 1893, the nation's leading race scholars put their findings on display at the World's Columbian Exposition, which became an event of immense cultural importance to America as it neared the turn of the century. Between May and October of 1893, Chicago's exposition hosted 27 million international visitors who learned about the cultures, values, and institutions of the world on display at the fair. The exposition showed visitors a variety of ideas on race and whiteness through displays that were intended to draw in viewers. In their most notable display, a group of Norwegians sailed a replica Viking ship, aptly named the Viking, and they sailed it across the Atlantic Ocean, down the Hudson River, across the Erie Canal, and across the Great Lakes to Chicago. I mean, a pretty amazing feat. And so the stunt, which within the context of the fair, marked a feat of modern technology and advancement, served a larger figurative importance for Norwegians and Scandinavians at large. The Viking journey was so notable at the time that the New York Times reported that the ship became the gem of the exposition, even though its presence challenged the exposition's Columbian focus. And so they really doubled down on this too. So the Viking sailing symbolized the Vikings' discovery of America, and Scandinavian newspapers used the forum of the exposition to position Nordics as more American than Americans. So American readers may have taken offense to this argument if, for example, it was an Italian community making the same argument about Columbus. This, however, was not the case. Instead, the homemaking myth illustrated the role that Scandinavians and Scandinavian Americans played in furthering the narrative of white privilege on their own behalf. The first historical descriptions of Vikings transcribed in English heroicized the brute masculinity involved in marauding and pillaging in a glossy 19th century version of the typical blonde, blue-eyed Nordic. And the symbol of the Viking in popular memory embodied a race of tall, wild men whom historian O.N. Nelson styled as strong and robust, having white bodies, yellow hair, broad shoulders, wiry muscles, florid complexions, and fierce blue eyes that during excitement gleamed with fire and passion. How he knew this, I don't know. The cultural symbol of the Viking also represented strong individuality and a love for freedom to Scandinavian men who adopted the identity as a means of connecting ethnic tradition to an imagined masculine image. Vikings represented the epitome of the evolved man, according to Nelson. Despite the sordid past of the Viking age, Nelson interpreted the racial features of Vikings as that of stereotypical features of Scandinavian men in the 1890s as a means of further benefiting Nordics in America. And given a different context or racial climate, the Scandinavian celebration of Leif Erikson as the true discoverer of America could easily have backfired and detrimentally affected the position of Nordics in America. But instead, it worked to their favor. In the months leading up to the exposition, a prominent group of Norwegian Americans in Chicago organized a celebration meant to contrast with the city's commemoration of Columbus Day in October 1892. Again, very bold. So to educate the American public, but also venerate Leif Erikson's discovery, The group arranged a panel of prestigious speakers who best represented successful Scandinavians living in America, which included Norwegian-American attorney A.J. Elvig, historian John Fisk of Harvard, and the editor of Scandinavian, P.A. Conradi. And so a journalist from the Chicago Tribune described the event as civilized, intellectually stimulating, and thoughtfully argued. Though distracted by, quote, the pretty girls in red frocks, the pageantry impressed the journalist. The audience displayed the era's ideals of racial purity, with beautiful mothers and fathers, with Nordic racial features, there to recount the heroic traditions of Eric the Red. And the reporter's infatuation with the Nordic whiteness and the privilege of prominent Scandinavian Americans in attendance furthered the importance of the event's message to Americans. Fisk's lecture focused on the historical origins of Scandinavians in America and their racial legacy of whiteness by noting for the audience that the first white child born in America had a Norwegian mother. And Conradi called upon the audience to reflect upon Columbus's theft of credit for discovery of the New World. I'm going to put discovery in huge quotation marks here. And to teach their children that, quote, the sturdy sons of Norway should receive the honor and reward for claiming North America. The reporter concluded by stating that editorially, the speakers proved the group's position and that Erickson should be given his due diligence in history books as the true discoverer of America 400 years before Columbus. So now, we get to dumb blondes. So the popular slapstick film series of the 1910s, Sweetie, the Swedish Maid, provides further evidence of the complicated nature of whiteness. The character of Sweetie was a product of discourse on whiteness and gender and formed the basis of a lasting ideology of Scandinavian ethnic identity. According to film historian Arne Lund, Nordic characters were mythical, essential, natural. Yet portrayals of Scandinavian hyper-whiteness in film were far different than Scandinavians navigating American life. The Sweetie film series, produced by S&A Studio, included 29 comedic short films between 1914 and 1916 and featured American actor Wallace Beery. The most significant element of the films was that a male actor dressed in drag, as we see here, the beautiful Sweetie. And so this was an intentional gag meant to defeminize Swedish women specifically and domestic servants generally who played the title character. Domestics constituted the classic women adrift that concerned middle-class progressives. While they did not occupy a homogeneous group, women living adrift were young, single, independent wage earners who lived away from their families and acted out of their assigned place in patriarchal society. The American approach of addressing the problem of women living adrift was to ridicule, to stereotype, to place blame on immigrant women for choosing to live outside of social norms. And to American audiences, Sweetie was a caricature of the typical Scandinavian domestic servant of the early 20th century. She was stupid. She was physically repugnant. She was hardworking to a fault. And she resisted Americanization in dress and manner. She acted in childish and impulsive ways that one might interpret as a threat to the patriarchal order or even dangerous. And Americans categorized European immigrants as a way of coming to terms with the massive cultural shift brought about by immigration. Even before S&A Studios popularized Sweetie in Chicago, the stereotypical Swedish maid was ingrained in American culture. A 1908 New York Times article reported on a battle of the sexes that occurred in Englewood, New Jersey. And this was when the local women's club and a rival team of 18 girls comprised of amateur baseball players competed for the community baseball title. According to the article, a big Swedish maid with flaxen locks, played by a mustachioed man who brazenly smoked cigars, wore a yellow wig, received the biggest laugh from the crowd. And such humor made use of robust masculinity to play upon the absurdity of cultural norms and also of cross-dressing. Sweetie was the embodiment of American cultural stereotypes formed around the dumb blonde persona of the Swedish maid. However, the fact that her physicality did not mirror this persona is indicative of the expressed confusion over whiteness during the early 20th century. Here are real Swedish maids too, nothing like Sweetie. Okay. So in my research, I was very excited when I came across what I believe to be one of the first dumb blonde jokes in reference to Swedish maids. And American depictions of Scandinavian men and women as clumsy, rural, childish, worked in their favor and helped to further elevate the race. So rather than dangerous or deviant like other groups of European immigrants, to Americans, Scandinavians were innocuous, while their whiteness helped to elevate their social status. Chicago newspapers and other American works use the language of social Darwinism to portray Scandinavians, particularly women, as a component of the strong white races. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American and Scandinavian writers like Owen Nelson, who I mentioned before, also Kendrick Babcock, John Commons, and Henry Pratt Fairchild, considered rural Scandinavians to originate from especially strong racial stock. Steeped in romantic associations of agrarian life and virtue, they argued that Scandinavians' rural connections to home worked in their benefit in America. Economist John Commons predicted that Scandinavians would not become a financial draw upon the American government like some new immigrants would because of their rural heritage. And because Scandinavians were strong, they were able-bodied for work, they were more readily accepted into white American society. The cultural stereotype of the loyal and quiet and hardworking demeanor of the Scandinavian domestic workers contrasts with another that depicted Scandinavian immigrants as slow, dim-witted, gullible. Scandinavian writers contributed to stereotyping through class-based jokes made at the expense of the lower classes and also their rural compatriots. One common joke featured a Scandinavian servant standing in the kitchen next to a cooked pig, holding an apple in her mouth and curled paper in her ears because she did not translate the recipe correctly. It's supposed to go in the pig. So the impetus behind this commonly shared joke in Scandinavia intended to depict backward rural laborers as dim-witted or frivolous, and the humor was different from an American perspective. Instead, rural Scandinavians were of strong racial stock, though still the center of ridicule because of their immigrant and foreign status from the American perspective. So even before the Sweetie films portrayed the dim-witted Swedish maid to Chicago's audiences, American magazines and newspapers constructed the Nordic dumb blonde. So in one such jab at the lack of intelligence among Scandinavian domestics, the popular satirical magazine Puck published a joke similar to Scandinavian humor. So, the fortune teller, I can read that there is to be a wreck in your home and it will be caused by a blonde woman. Patron, oh, that has already occurred. Our new Swedish maid let the dumbwaiter fall and broke all the dishes. And so, according to this joke, the Scandinavian domestic workers struggled in American households to acclimate themselves to popular customs, especially in homes with more modernized features than that of Scandinavia. And furthermore, the use of dumbwaiter alongside Swedish maid was a play on words intended to depict the servant in comparative fashion. The influence of the dim-witted persona of Scandinavian women and men was especially strong in the upper Midwest, where the infamous Ole and Lena jokes began to circulate. So, just a few more slides to show you some of the beautiful images that I came across in my research, and these appear in my book as well. So, this was Pauline Hegward Nilsson, and she worked as a shop girl in Montgomery wards in Chicago in the 1890s, and she followed a very similar path to many Swedish or Swedish status young women, in that she worked until she met a young Swedish-American man, and they married and she left the workforce. But before that, she worked at Montgomery wards and had her photograph taken alongside the other shop girls, and she left behind these wonderful journals. These are at North Park if you ever wanted to look them up. But she talks about her experiences of working alongside other young Swedish women who had very lofty ambitions, and they looked very similar, and they dressed of sort of the upper class status that other American women appeared who were their patrons at Montgomery wards. And then, right around the 1910s, there is this white slave panic in America, and it really takes hold of Chicago. But as I found in my work, the Scandinavian community treated this problem of vice and concerns over white slavery much differently than other immigrant communities. So what I found was that amid this white slavery scare, where American social purity reformers feared that the whitest of all white immigrant girls would be kidnapped and sold into prostitution, typically by what were described and perceived as like swarthy men. Scandinavians in Chicago took a more progressive approach to acknowledging issues of vice within their communities and saying, we are dealing with this internally, but we also need to address that this could potentially be a problem. So to conclude, I wanted to just talk about the continued work in the field and sort of where I've seen the direction of the field going, and just places for ideas for growth. By the end of the 20th century, the exaggerated image of the idealized Nordic man and woman loomed as an inauthentic and often sexualized category from which Scandinavian Americans sought to separate themselves. In this unique perspective, the Scandinavian struggle for racial and ethnic legitimacy occurred in reverse. And so I wanted to, encourage you, if you haven't already, run out and purchased Swedish-American Borderlands by my colleagues here. It just recently came out. It is fantastic. I just wrote a review on it, so. So this work points to new opportunities for direction within the historiography. So there are fantastic works that feature like the history of foodways, of gender, interrogation of ideological borders that is simply fantastic. And there remains an understandable avoidance of discussions that imply white privilege in the history of Scandinavians in America. And as late as the early 2010s, the historiographic focus was largely structured upon the victimization of groups who fought to win racial legitimacy, and far less on those whose whiteness had not been a point of deliberation. And so there's a number of different directions as well. So I see that there's quite a bit of work that could still be done in terms of looking at Nordic whiteness and gender, which of course is very dear to my heart. The perspective of youth and also intergenerational conflicts, Scandinavians in urban areas besides Chicago, Seattle, etc. And then also the interaction of Nordic people and other groups, so especially Black Americans, for example. And then I also wanted to show you this anthology that I was a co-editor on, and it just came out in 2020. And this also begins to fill in some of these historiographic gaps. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Erika, very much for this interesting exploration of stereotypes of racial and white privilege in Scandinavians, a rich area to be explored further. I think we have time for a few questions. I think we'll take a few questions directly after each talk. And I invite you to ask a question or two of Erika Jackson. Yes, please.
The ship that was at the Colombian Expo, do you know where it is now?
I don't. Does anybody know where the ship is or if it exists?
It's in Chicago.
Is it on display?
Sort of. It's not in very good condition.
I would imagine it wouldn't be, yeah.
I think it's in Geneva, right?
Right.
In Chicago. It's like Good Templar Park in Geneva.
That's fantastic.
Good Templar Park in Geneva, Illinois. So when you're there next, don't miss the Viking ship.
Yeah, yes.
Yes, Kim.
So my question falls somewhat outside the scope of your presentation, but I think it stays well within the limits of your expertise. So if you humor me, I think it's fair to say that whiteness in Sweden today is in a state of flux.
Yes.
Due to not only non-white immigrants, such as my parents, but also to the mobilization of domestic minorities, such as the Sami or the Roma, for instance. And I'm just curious to hear how, if at all, this has affected Swedish-American discourses on the Nordic identity and whiteness in the States here today.
Yes, so I'm not nearly as familiar with more of like the contemporary discussion of whiteness in Sweden. I follow as much as I can. But there are really wonderful representations that have come out recently in film, in popular culture, that really interrogate these discussions of sort of the state of whiteness. And I would absolutely agree that it is in this state of flux. Most certainly. And I would love to talk to you more about your perspective as well, so we'll have to get together after this. So yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Jonas.
I don't know if you came across Ben Gunnes, Norwegian serial killer. around the area when you're looking at?
Yeah, was he the one on the ship?
a woman. It's a
Oh, the
woman,
woman.
yeah.
No, I did not.
She murders a number of people in northern Indiana, just outside Chicago.
Oh, wait, no, I did. Yes.
And the description there is not all that flattering. She's this female Bluebeard, and she lures these, and I guess that goes to the gullibility,
Yeah.
these unsuspecting Norwegian bachelors from all over the country, and then kills them off. So,
Yes.
and they're all described in very sort of odd terms, and they're not really American. They're kind of this weird group that's only speaking Norwegian to each other, and it's not in any way.
Oh, has anybody written about that?
I just tried to, yeah. But it's
Janet Langlois has a book about
Oh.
from a folklore.
Oh, interesting.
And I don't think she takes up ethnicity as a particular issue.
Oh, okay.
So there's probably room there for a lot.
No, I've looked at how the American newspapers around there covered it, and it's not a flattering portrayal of Norwegians or Scandinavians.
I would think not. Yeah. Well, and it would be interesting too to sort of take more of like a contemporary spin on the popularity of true crime and adding more projects. Other questions?
Yes.
I think your comments about Scandinavians being the ideal immigrants are really underscored by the numerous comments of our former president about what kind of immigrants he would like to see coming in. Norwegians. Norwegians kept coming up all the time, which actually was kind of a dog whistle thing. You know, you don't have to say white, you don't have to say Christian, you don't have to say Northern European, you don't have to say not brown, just say Norwegian. And that would do it. And it just, I don't know, it always struck me as sort of odd that for some reason that was such a sticking point in his brain, but that wasn't the only one. So
I was working on the copy editing phase of my book, and then he made the statement that we all know about which countries we would like more immigrants from and which we would not, and what he called those countries. And I said, oh my gosh, stop the presses, I need to add this to my conclusion, because it really did prove this argument that I was trying to make, which is when we talk about Scandinavians within a contemporary perspective, we all have this sort of stereotypical but positive image that is related to the whitest of the white races.
and think about the Greek immigrants, or
Exactly.
Turkish or Somali immigrants now.
Yeah, it was really like the only comment he made in his entire administration that I said, yes, this is great, I'm going to add it to my book. Yes.
Could you comment more about the perceived vulnerability of whiteness, white women, white children, with the whole idea of white slavery? It resonates with a legend of American Indians desiring to steal white children.
Yes.
And so you have to hide your children under the bed so they won't be stolen. And so what's going on there with this perception of vulnerability?
It really was this concern over the Second Industrial Revolution and women more and more young, single, living adrift, entering the workforce. And it wasn't so much a fear of them being kidnapped and forced into prostitution. It was much more wrapped up in these conversations about fears over miscegenation, fears over, sort of like sullying the white races. And so it was this conversation that was built around these women that I talk about in chapter 4, I believe, that there was this editorial that these young working girls wrote into one of the Swedish language newspapers and said, in more contemporary terms, like, we have autonomy and stop calling us vulnerable. We are strong, we are hardworking, we have jobs, we have dreams that go beyond what people expect of us within the society that we'll just work a job and then we'll get married and exit the workforce. And so there is this pushback that's happening that's really interesting too, because that must have been very brave for individuals to do at that time, especially given the conversation of this is a woman's place, this is a man's place. And women, it's now acceptable for them to be in the workforce, but only until they get married, especially if you're coming from a certain class of individuals and then you need to exit the workforce once you get married. And so it really was built into more of those fears of women becoming independent and what that was going to bring. So.
Any more comments or questions? We could add for all these Swedish maids in Chicago and in New York and other urban areas, of course, there's a classic article from many years ago called Emigration as Emancipation.
Yes.
For many of these women, they came from rural areas where they were maids, living under very difficult conditions, and coming to America to get a real job with regulated working hours, day off, and pay and so forth, was actually a way up, in a sense, and increased independence, as you say, increased autonomy. And many of their friends back home who still worked in the rural bad conditions knew of this as an opportunity in America. To come to Chicago or come to New York or somewhere. The Swedish maid.
And living in these palatial homes on Prairie Avenue. I mean, can't beat that.
No, how can you beat that? Yes.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much, Erika.
Thank you. And I do invite any of you to please email me if you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in front of a big crowd. So.
Okay.